He kissed her forehead that morning and told her he had a business dinner. She smiled and said, "Come home safe." What she didn't say, what she had been swallowing for 6 weeks, was that she already knew exactly where he was going, exactly who he was meeting, and exactly what he had been planning to do to her once their baby was born. Ronan Blackridge had spent 15 years building an empire on the assumption that loyalty could be bought and silence could be forced. He had never once considered that the most dangerous person in his world wasn't a rival boss or a federal investigator. It was the 6-month pregnant woman sleeping in his bed who had quietly memorized every account number, every shell company, and every password he thought no one knew existed. If that were you pregnant, betrayed, and surrounded by men who would hurt you if you made the wrong move, what would you do? If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because the stories we tell on this channel are the kind that stay with you. Give us a thumbs up, drop a comment, and tell us the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay until the very end because what Camille does next is something you will not see coming. The phone was not supposed to be there. That was the first thing Camille noticed, not the time on the clock, not the rain hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Manhattan penthouse, not even the particular way her back had been aching all evening in a low, persistent grind that her obstetrician had warned her about. It was the phone, a second phone, sitting face down on Ronan's nightstand, half tucked beneath the edge of his watch case, as though whoever placed it there had done so in a hurry and convinced themselves it was hidden. It was 2:17 in the morning. Ronan was asleep on his side, one arm thrown over his face the way he always slept when he'd had more than 2 glasses of scotch. His breathing was the slow, even kind, deeply under. The kind of sleep that took a long time to break through. Camille lay still for a full minute. She had learned in 6 years of marriage to this man that stillness was information. If you moved too fast, you showed your hand. If you stayed quiet, people filled the silence themselves. It was the first thing her father had ever taught her, back when she was 12 years old, watching him negotiate labor contracts at a kitchen table in Queens. Midja, the person who speaks first almost always loses. So she waited. Then, slowly, she reached across and picked up the phone. It wasn't locked. That surprised her. Ronan was meticulous about security in ways that most people found excessive 2-factor authentication on everything, rotating passwords, encrypted email. The fact that this phone had no lock screen at all told her something immediately. This was new. He hadn't had it long enough to be careful with it yet. The screen lit up. One message. No name attached to the contact, just a string of numbers she didn't recognize. 3 words and a time. Celeste, the Beaumont Hotel. 9:30 p.m. Camille read it twice. Then she set the phone back exactly where she'd found it, at the same angle, the same half-tucked position beneath the watch case. She rolled onto her back and stared at the ceiling. Her son shifted inside her, a slow rolling movement, like he was adjusting his position. She put one hand flat against her belly without thinking. She did not cry. She was mildly surprised by that. She had always imagined that if she ever found proof of something like this, she would fall apart immediately, that the emotion would be instant and overwhelming. Instead, what she felt was something quieter and stranger, kind of settling, as though some part of her had been waiting for this particular confirmation for a while now, and the waiting was finally over. She thought about Celeste Arden. Celeste had been part of their social world for almost 2 years, a corporate attorney with a brownstone in the West Village, and a way of entering rooms that made people look up. She was 31 years old, which Camille knew because Ronan had mentioned it once, in the context of a case Celeste was working on for Blackridge Capital, the legitimate face of everything Ronan had spent the last decade carefully constructing. She was beautiful in a precise, careful way, the kind of beautiful that required effort but concealed it. Camille had never once suspected her. That was perhaps the most instructive part of all of this. She lay awake until nearly 4 in the morning, not plotting anything yet, not making plans, just letting herself absorb what she now knew to be true. She thought about the last 6 months, the business trips that ran slightly longer than they used to. The evenings when Ronan came home distracted in a way she'd attributed to the pressure of an expansion deal his organization was pursuing in Eastern Europe. She thought about the way he'd been slightly more attentive to her recently, the flowers he'd sent to her upgained appointments when he couldn't attend in person, the weekends he'd made a point of being home. She had read those things as guilt and dismissed the reading as unfair to him. She hadn't been unfair. She'd been accurate. By the time pale light began showing at the edges of the curtains, Camille had made exactly one decision. She was not going to say anything. Not yet. Not until she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. She was, after all, still a financial investigator. She had simply been on an extended leave. The following evening, she told Ronan she was going to meet her friend Daniela for dinner and a movie. She said it casually, in the tone of someone making small plans, the kind of ordinary domestic coordination that had been the texture of their life together. He said fine. He kissed her cheek. He smelled of the cedar soap he used in the morning, and she noticed the faint care he was taking with his appearance, the shirt slightly more fitted than his usual business wear, the watch he only wore on occasions that mattered to him. She drove to the Beaumont Hotel herself. She didn't go inside immediately. She sat in a car across the street in the kind of cold that comes in off the Hudson and cuts straight through whatever you're wearing. She sat there for 22 minutes, and she told herself twice that she should leave, that there was no version of walking into that lobby that didn't end with her making a scene or breaking down in the middle of a 5-star hotel at 7 months pregnant, and neither of those outcomes served her. Then Ronan's car arrived. She watched him step out, watched the way he straightened his jacket, watched him check his phone once quickly, habit, and then pocket it, and walk toward the entrance with a particular kind of ease in his stride, the walk of a man who belonged somewhere and knew it. And then Celeste was there. She came from the direction of the bar, already inside, already waiting. She was wearing a dark dress, and her hair was down. Ronan saw her, and his whole face changed, not dramatically, not like something in a movie, but in the specific way that faces change when a person sees someone they want to see. It was a small shift. Camille recognized it because she used to produce it. He put his arm around Celeste and pulled her close and kissed her. Not a greeting kiss, not the kind of kiss that kept one eye on the room. The other kind. They walked to the elevator together. The doors closed. Camille sat in her car with both hands on the steering wheel and breathed. In through the nose, out slowly. Her son moved again, a sharper kick this time, near her ribs. She pressed her hand there automatically and said, very quietly, to no one I know. I know. She drove home. She changed into her nightgown. She brushed her teeth. She made a cup of chamomile tea she didn't drink and left it on the kitchen counter getting cold. Then she got into bed and picked up a book she wasn't reading and waited. Ronan came in at 12:40 a.m. She heard him before she saw him the elevator opening directly into the penthouse foyer, the soft sound of his shoes on the marble, the particular way he moved through the apartment when he thought she was asleep. Careful, not sneaking exactly. More like a man who had learned to re-enter his own home without disturbing it. He pushed the bedroom door open slowly. Camille looked up from the book. Long meeting? She said. He paused for just a fraction of a second. Brutal. Ran about 2 hours over. He started unknotting his tie. Sorry, I didn't text. I figured you'd be asleep. I couldn't get comfortable, she said, gesturing vaguely at her belly. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on her stomach. Warm and immediate, the way he always touched her there, like her pregnancy was something he was proud of. He been giving you trouble? He's fine, she said. Just restless. Ronan leaned down and kissed her hair, and she caught it. Then the smell, underneath the fresh-applied cologne he'd clearly put on before leaving the hotel, the trace of something that wasn't her. She kept her face completely still. She kept her breathing even. She thought, you are an investigator. You have interviewed men who lied to federal prosecutors without flinching. You can get through the next 3 minutes, she did. He went to the bathroom. She heard the shower run for a long time. When he came back, he was clean-shaved and smelling of the cedar soap again, and he got into bed beside her and reached over and turned off his lamp. He said, "Get some sleep, Camille," in the slightly distracted way of someone already half gone, and within 10 minutes, his breathing had evened out. Camille lay in the dark beside her sleeping husband. She thought about the message on the second phone. She thought about the way Celeste looked standing in that hotel lobby. She thought about her son, who would be born in approximately 10 weeks, into a life she was currently no longer certain she could predict. Then she started thinking about shell companies, because she knew about those. She had spent 4 years before marrying Ronan working as a financial investigator for a forensics firm that specialized in untangling exactly the kinds of complex corporate structures that powerful men used to move money invisibly. She had testified in 3 federal cases. She had been deposed in 11 civil proceedings. She had sat across from accountants who thought they were smarter than her and watched them slowly realize they were not. She had been very good at her job. She had stopped working when Ronan asked her to, 2 years into their marriage, framing it as concern for her stress levels and the early pregnancy she'd subsequently lost. She had understood even then that his real concern was different, that having a wife who spent her days tracing hidden assets was professionally inconvenient for a man who had a great many hidden assets. She'd agreed partly because grief had made her tired, and partly because she had at that point still trusted him, with the soft parts of herself. That particular version of trust was now closed. What opened in its place was not anger exactly. Anger was too hot, too immediate. What opened was something colder and more operational. She began, there in the dark, to reconstruct from memory what she knew about the structure of Blackridge Capital and its subsidiaries, the names she'd encountered at dinner tables and charity events, and quiet conversations she wasn't supposed to be absorbing as carefully as she had. She thought about a conversation she'd overheard 3 months ago. Ronan and his consigliere, Marco Vitale, in the study. She'd been in the hallway, and the door was not fully closed, and she had heard Marco's voice. "First, the structure needs to be cleaner. The Genova holding has too many connecting threads, and Ronan, after the baby. We restructure after the baby." She had filed that away as business. General reorganization of assets, the kind of thing Ronan periodically did for legitimate tax efficiency reasons. She had not thought much of it. Now she thought much of it. After the baby. She thought about what that phrase might mean in a different context. A man who was planning to replace one wife with another would not do so with the newborn in the picture if he could help it. Too complicated, too expensive in the wrong directions. But if he moved quickly after the birth, while Camille was physically recovering and legally vulnerable, while he still controlled the bulk of their marital assets, while she had not yet had the opportunity to establish her own footing as a mother, then the timing made a different kind of sense. She was not certain. She told herself she was not certain. But she had spent years learning to trust the thing her mind did when it recognized a pattern even before she could name all the pieces. And her mind was telling her something very specific right now. So she lay there beside the man she had married, and the man she now understood she had never fully known. And she began quietly, systematically, with the particular patience of someone who had learned that moving too fast was the most common and most costly mistake to become a plan. Her son kicked again. "I know," she whispered. "I've got us." She did not sleep that night. Not really. She drifted in and out of something shallow that wasn't rest, and by the time the morning light came hard through the curtains, she had the beginning of an outline in her head that was less a plan than a set of questions she needed answers to. The first question was the simplest. What exactly did she have legal authority over? She knew the answer to part of that already. There were joint accounts she had equal signing authority on. There were investment portfolios from before the marriage that she had maintained under her own name. There was property in Connecticut that had been gifted to her personally by her grandmother, a detail that her prenuptial agreement explicitly carved out from marital assets. There were smaller accounts she managed for household expenses that Ronan had never paid much attention to because the amounts, relative to the scale of Blackridge Capital, were negligible. None of that was the whole picture. She needed the whole picture. And to get the whole picture, she needed help from someone who was better than her at the particular kind of digital archaeology this was going to require. She needed her brother. Nico Varela was 34 years old and worked in cybersecurity in a technical capacity that Camille had never fully understood and had stopped asking him to explain in detail several years ago. What she understood was the bottom line. He was very good at finding information that had been deliberately obscured, and he was meticulous about the legal line between what was permissible and what wasn't. He had spent 2 years as a consultant for a federal agency he was not allowed to name. He had turned down offers from several private firms for reasons she suspected were mostly about not wanting to work for people who made him feel uncomfortable. He also loved his sister with an intensity that had, at various points in her life, gotten both of them into complicated situations. She called him from the car, driving to what she told Ronan was a prenatal yoga class. Nico picked up on the second ring. "Hey, you okay?" She had not told him anything yet. But brothers know things sometimes before you've said them, especially when you've been close your whole lives, and the person calling has a particular quality in their voice. "I need to see you," she said. "In person. Not at your place and not at mine." Pause. "How bad?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what I need your help to find out." Another pause. Longer. She heard him shift something on his end, what might have been a keyboard. "Text me when and where," he said. "I'll be there." She exhaled. It was the first breath she'd taken in what felt like hours that went all the way down. "Thank you, Nico." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't told me what you need." She almost laughed. "No," she agreed. "I haven't." She drove to the yoga class anyway, because she needed the alibi to be clean. And she sat in the back and breathed. Through positions her body was too heavily pregnant to complete, and stared at the floor and thought about all the things she was going to need to know, and all the ways in which a man like Ronan Blackridge, a man who had spent 15 years hiding money from people, whose entire professional purpose was finding it was going to be difficult to outmaneuver. Difficult, she reminded herself. Not impossible. She had, after all, been trained by the best. And she had spent 6 years living in this man's house, attending his dinners, sitting across from his allies and his attorneys and his accountants, absorbing everything while he assumed she was simply decorating the room. He had forgotten what she was before she was his wife. That was going to be the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. She just needed time. She needed to be patient. She needed to move without being seen moving, which meant she needed to keep sitting across from him at dinner and sleeping him beside him at night and kissing him goodbye in the morning with the same warmth she'd always shown. Because the moment he saw something change in her, the whole thing would collapse before it started. She could do that. She had been doing it already, without knowing it was what she was doing. She sat in that yoga class and breathed, and around her other women stretched and talked quietly, and laughed at something, the instructor said, and the ordinary world continued exactly as it always had. And Camille Varela held all of it together inside her, and felt something shift into place in the center of her chest. Not rage, not grief. Something quieter than both. Something that, if you'd asked her to name it, she might have called readiness. The coffee shop Camille chose was in Astoria, far enough from Manhattan that nobody Ronan knew would wander in by accident, close enough to the neighborhood where she and Nico had grown up that it felt like neutral ground. It was the kind of place that had been there for 30 years. Without changing much, the same cracked vinyl on the booth seats, the same handwritten specials board, the same smell of burnt espresso, and something sweet from the bakery next door bleeding through the wall. She got there 20 minutes early. She ordered decaf and a glass of water, and sat in the back booth facing the door, and she watched people come in and out, and she thought about what exactly she was going to say to her brother. She still hadn't figured out the right framing when the bell above the door jangled, and Nico walked in wearing a gray jacket over a dark hoodie, scanning the room with the particular habit of attention he'd developed during those years of work he didn't talk about. He saw her and came straight back without stopping at the counter. He slid into the booth across from her and looked at her face for about 3 seconds. "You've been awake all night," he said. "Most of it." "Is it Ronan?" It wasn't a question. she noticed that. Yes, he didn't say anything right away. He picked up the laminated menu and looked at it, even though they both knew he wasn't going to order anything. It was a thing he did when he was thinking, a small buffer he allowed himself before responding to something that required real thought. She'd watched him do it their whole lives. He put the menu down. Tell me. So she did. She told him about the phone. She told him about the Beaumont Hotel and what she'd watched from across the lobby. She told him about Celeste Arden. She told him because she was being completely honest, and she needed him to understand the full scope about the conversation she'd overheard 3 months ago between Ronan and Marco Vitale after the baby. We restructure after the baby and the way it had sat in the back of her mind without context until now. She told him what she suspected the timeline meant. Nico listened to all of it without interrupting. His face did a complicated series thing she tracked but didn't comment on. She watched him move from concern to anger to something quieter and more controlled that she recognized as the mode he shifted into when a problem required actual strategy rather than reaction. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How certain are you?" he said. "About the restructuring piece. That it's about moving assets before he pushes you out." "I'm not certain," she said, "but I've spent 4 years building cases on less." He nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I need to know the actual shape of what he controls. Not what's on paper, the real picture. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anything connected to Blackridge Capital that wasn't disclosed in our prenuptial financial statements." "Camille." He said her name in a specific tone. The one that meant, "You're asking me something I need to think about carefully before I answer." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm asking you to help me access what I can legally access and understand what I'm looking at. There's a line there that's narrow. I know where the line is. I spent 4 years right next to it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her belly, which she was aware he'd been carefully not looking at since he sat down, the way people sometimes avoided looking at the thing that made the situation feel most real. "He's not going to know you're looking," Nikos said. "It wasn't a question either. Not until I'm ready for him to. And when you're ready," she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, "then he'll know everything at once." Nico pulled out his own phone and opened a notes app. "Start with what you already have access to. Joint accounts, property titles, anything in both your names. We build outward from there. Anything that connects to the legitimate Blackridge capital structure you have a spousal interest in through the marital estate. That's a thread we can pull without crossing anything. And what's not connected on paper?" He looked at her steadily. "That's where it gets harder. I know. If there are accounts that are genuinely separate, held under entities with no visible connection to Ronan personally, I can't just—" "I know, Nico. But I've been sitting at his dinners for 6 years. I've heard things. Names. Numbers occasionally. Structures he mentioned to me directly because he trusted me and assumed I wasn't paying the kind of attention I was actually paying." Nico was quiet again. "You've been keeping notes," he said. In my head, he almost smiled. It was not a happy expression. "Okay, then we start with what's in your head." They stayed in that booth for 2.5 hours. Coffee shop filled up and emptied again around them. Camille talked and Nico typed, and by the time they stood up to leave, they had the beginning of a map, incomplete, full of gaps, but real. Starting point. Outside on the sidewalk, Nico stopped her with a hand on her arm. "I need you to be careful," he said. "Not because I think you're not smart enough to do this. You're the smartest person in our family, and we both know it. But because Ronan he's not just a man with money, Cammy. The people around him, I know what he is," she said quietly. Nico's jaw tightened. She understood that he'd always known more than he'd let on. That he'd had concerns he hadn't voiced because she was happy or seemed happy, and he'd loved her enough to let her have that without qualification. "How long have you known?" she said. "Known what?" "What he actually is." A long pause. A cab went by too fast on the wet street. "I had suspicions. I didn't have proof. And you seemed happy." "Yes." She nodded. She wasn't angry at him for it. She would have done the same. "Well," she said, "now we have a different problem." He pulled her into a hug that was slightly too tight and lasted slightly too long, the kind of hug that has something else underneath it: worry, guilt, protectiveness. She let him hold on. "Don't tell anyone else," she said into his shoulder. "Not yet. Who would I tell? Mom, obviously not Mom." He pulled back and looked at her. "You need to keep everything normal on your end. Don't change how you act with him." "Don't I know," she said. "I've been doing it for 6 weeks already." He searched her face. "You've known for 6 weeks?" "I suspected for 6 weeks, now I know." He shook his head slowly, in the way of someone recalibrating something. "You're terrifying sometimes, you know that?" She kissed his cheek. "Call me when you have something." She drove back to Manhattan and made it home before Ronan. And she was in the kitchen cooking when he came in, and they ate dinner together and talked about a documentary they'd both been meaning to watch, and whether the second bedroom needed to be repainted before the nursery furniture arrived. When something died quietly, Ronan thought the current color was fine. Camille said she wanted something warmer, something that wouldn't feel cold in winter when they were up at 3 in the morning. He conceded the point easily, the way he did on domestic things that didn't cost him in ways he counted. She watched him cut his chicken. She thought, "You have no idea." And then she thought, "Good." The weeks that followed had a particular texture that Camille would later find difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't lived something similar. On the surface, everything was exactly what it had always been. Meals together, evenings on the couch, appointments with her obstetrician that Ronan attended 3 out of every 4 times, always with flowers, always with the particular attentiveness he'd shown throughout the pregnancy. His hand on the small of her back in waiting rooms. His phone put away the visible phone, the real phone when she was talking to him. Underneath that surface she was working. Not every day. She couldn't risk a pattern. But in scattered hours when Ronan was traveling, when he was in his study in the evenings, and she told him she was going to read, she went through everything she had access to with the slow, methodical patience she'd trained herself to maintain, even when everything underneath wanted to move faster. Nico called her in pieces. He'd found a holding company, registered in Delaware, with no visible officers, that it had 3 wire transfers connected to an account Camille had signing authority on. It was small, the transfers, each under 10,000, clearly designed to stay below reporting thresholds, but the Delaware entity had a tax ID number, and that number connected to a law firm in the Cayman Islands that had filed registration documents for 6 other entities in the preceding 2 years. 6, Camille said. "That I can see from here," Nico said. "There may be more. What kind of assets?" "I think real estate. I think at least 2 of them are property holdings. One of them may be connected to a portfolio of short-term investment vehicles, but I haven't been able to pin that down yet." "Keep going." "Camille, are you sleeping?" "Enough. You're 8 months pregnant." "Nico." "Keep going." There was a pause, and then the sound of him typing again, and she sat in the small room off the master bedroom that she'd been using as a reading room since the 2nd trimester, surrounded by pillows and a lamp that cast yellow light, and she took notes in a notebook. She kept inside a box of pregnancy journals because she knew that was the last place Ronan would ever look. She was cross-referencing a set of property records. Nico had sent her 3 addresses, 2 in New York and 1 in Connecticut, all registered under entity names, with no obvious connection to Ronan Blackridge when the study door opened down the hall. She closed the notebook. She was reaching for the pregnancy journal on top when Ronan appeared in the doorway. "Still up?" he said. He looked tired. He'd had a late call, some European business, which was real enough she'd heard him on it through the wall. "Can't get comfortable," she said. It was the same thing she always said. It had the advantage of being true. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something moved behind his eyes. Then he said, "Come to bed." "In a minute." He nodded. He didn't move immediately. He stood in the doorway looking at her with that same unreadable expression, and for one terrible second she felt the floor drop slightly beneath her, because she thought, he knows. He's seen something. He's noticed a shift in the accounts, or someone told him, or he found the notebook. "You look tired," he said. "I am," she said. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair. which was something he rarely did, physically lowered himself, put himself below her eye level, looked up at her. He put one hand on her knee. I know I've been distracted lately. Work stuff. I want you to know I'm going to be more present when the baby comes. I mean that. She looked at him. He meant it. That was the most devastating thing. She could read him well enough by now to know when he was performing sincerity versus when it was real. And this was real. This small, crouching, earnest version of Ronan Blackridge, who was capable of meaning two completely contradictory things at exactly the same time. He loved her in whatever way he was capable of loving anyone. He also intended to discard her when it suited him. Both things were true. I know you do, she said softly. He stood up. He kissed her forehead. He went to bed. She sat in the chair for another 40 minutes and did not pick up the notebook again. The next morning, she called Nico from the car again. There's a property in Connecticut, she said. 3-bedroom, on a lake. Registered to an entity called Westfield Horizon LLC. I see it. That entity was created 18 months ago. During our marriage, under Connecticut law, assets created during the marriage using marital funds are presumptively marital property regardless of how they're titled. Silence on his end. Then you've been researching family law. Nights, she said. Camille, I'm fine. I need you to help me figure out whether Westfield Horizon's formation documents can be traced to any account that I have verifiable access to. She heard him exhale. If we can trace even one wire from a joint account to the formation costs or initial deposits of that LLC, then I have a claim to the underlying asset. Potentially, yes, depending on how a court reads it. How many of these entities do you think are structured that way? Nico was quiet for a moment. Camille, I've found 11 so far. She pulled over. She was on the West Side Highway, and she pulled onto a narrow shoulder and put the car in park and sat there with trucks going by close enough to rock the car slightly, and she breathed. 11 entities, each one potentially holding real estate, accounts, investment portfolios. Each one created during a marriage Ronan had been conducting in parallel with a relationship he'd been planning to transition into once the timing worked in his favor. Each one a piece of a fortune he had been deliberately, carefully moving out of any accounting that might affect a divorce settlement. She had known it was significant. She had not known it was that significant. Are you there? Nico said. Yes, I need you to not react right now. I need you to stay calm. I'm calm. You pulled over. I'm calm, she repeated, a long breath from Zen. There's something else. She waited. I found a communication. I'm not going to tell you how I found it, because I don't want you to have that information. But there was an exchange Ronan and someone I think is a legal contact, possibly an attorney about custody arrangements. Her hand tightened on the phone. The framing of it, Nico said carefully, is that he's been getting advice about what his position would be if he initiated proceedings. Grounds timeline, the question of primary custody. She said nothing. Cammy, when was this exchange? 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago she had been 7 months pregnant. 3 weeks ago they had spent a Sunday afternoon in the park near their building, walking slowly, Ronan's hand in hers, talking about names. She had said Julian. He had said he liked it. They had sat on a bench in the thin late-season sun and watched dogs run across the grass. Okay, she said. That's not you don't need to be okay right now. I know, she said, but I am, or I will be. I need to be. She watched a barge move on the river beyond the highway barrier. Slow and enormous and completely indifferent. How much time do I have, do you think, before he moves on any of this? If he's still in the information gathering phase with his attorney, you might have post-birth, maybe a few months. He'll want the baby born and the initial period passed before any public action. More stable for his legal position. So I have a window. A narrow one. She nodded even though he couldn't see her. Then we need to move faster. What came next was the part of the story that would be hardest to explain to anyone who had never done it, the dual life of those remaining weeks. Camille went to her Obgyn appointments. She assembled the nursery furniture with the help of a woman named Petra, who came twice a week to help around the apartment as her mobility decreased. She attended 2 dinners with Ronan's inner circle, seated at long tables in private dining rooms, listening to the men around her, talk about business in the way they always did when she was there carefully, with certain silences she had learned to hear as loudly as the words. She smiled at Marco Vitale across one of those tables, and he smiled back, and she thought, "You know. You've been in this with him from the beginning." She filed that away. She was building something that required every piece. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks before her due date, she got what she needed. She was in the reading room. She spent most evenings there now, and Ronan had stopped questioning it, attributing it to the late discomfort of pregnancy, and her phone buzzed with a message from Nico. A single word found it. She called him immediately. "Say it. Blackridge Capital has a subsidiary called Meridian Asset Partners. You've probably heard the name." Vaguely. Meridian holds controlling interest in a portfolio of commercial properties. 11 buildings, 3 states. The aggregate value conservative estimate is somewhere between $80 and $110 million. She pressed 2 fingers to her lips. Meridian's initial capitalization, Nico continued, came from a series of transfers over a 14-month period. I've traced 4 of those transfers to accounts that are jointly held by you and Ronan, which means you have a legitimate spousal interest in at least a portion of Meridian's assets that he cannot unilaterally terminate. Can he restructure it before I act? Move the capitalization funds through additional entities to break the chain? He could try. It would take time, and it would require cooperation from the attorneys who structured the original deals. And some of those attorneys are also aware of financial irregularities in Meridian's operations that they would not want scrutinized. He paused. Some of those irregularities border on money laundering, Camille. If the right people looked at Meridian's transaction history, they'd find more than just asset concealment, significantly more. She sat with that for a moment. This was the thing she had not let herself think about fully until now, if what she found went beyond civil divorce territory and into something that required involving authorities. She had told herself she would cross that bridge when she came to it. She was at the bridge. Nico, if I bring this to a forensic attorney and to authorities, what happens to him? Her brother was quiet for a long moment. I think you know the answer to that. Say it anyway. It ends him. Not just the marriage. Not just the assets. The organization, the protection he's built, the political connections, all of it becomes exposed at once. She thought about the man who had crouched in front of her chair 3 weeks ago and said, "I'm going to be more present." She thought about the exchange with the attorney about custody arrangements. She thought about her son, who was due in 3 weeks, and who was going to be born into whatever she built next. "Okay," she said. Okay, meaning. I need you to help me compile everything into a form that an attorney can work with. Clean documentation, legal chains of connection, nothing that was obtained in a way that would compromise the evidentiary value. That's going to take, I know how long it takes. I need it done before the birth, Nico. Whatever comes after, I need to be positioned before he has a newborn to use as leverage." Another long pause. She heard him stand up, heard the shift of his chair. "All right," he said. "I'm going to need to call in some help. Careful people. Be sure about them." "I am," he said. "I always am." She went back to the apartment. Ronan was in the study, his real phone out on the desk, talking to someone in a low voice that went quieter when she passed the half-open door. She registered that without showing that she registered it. She went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the window, looking at the lights on the river. And she thought about what came next. She thought about it for a long time. Then she heard it. She hadn't intended to listen. She was moving back toward the hallway, glass in hand, when Ronan's voice shifted, dropped lower but lost its careful smoothness, took on the particular edge of a man who was speaking openly because he believed he was alone. She stopped in the shadow of the hallway, 2 steps from the study doorway, and she heard Marco Vitale's voice from the speakerphone. Timing makes sense. After the birth, when she's recovering. She won't have the capacity to Ronan. The legal position is cleaner if we initiate from a place of documented instability. If she's emotional, if she's not coping, Marco, the credibility question is the main thing. We need her credibility damaged before she's a chance to. Ronan. She's not going to be a problem. She's not that person anymore. She gave that up when she married me. Silence on the call. Then Marco and the kid? Ronan, mine. It's non-negotiable. Whatever arrangement the attorneys build, primary custody is mine. She can have visitation. Camille stood in the dark hallway, with a glass of water in her hand. She felt her son move inside her, a long, slow roll, unhurried, as though he had time. As though they both did. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She stood there, and she listened until Ronan said his goodbyes, and the call ended, and she heard the shift of his chair. Then she walked quietly to the bedroom, and set her glass on the nightstand, and got into bed and pulled the blanket up and lay there in the dark, past the point where any part of this could be undone. She had known that already, intellectually. But there is a difference between knowing something and having it settle into your bones at 2 in the morning in the dark, while the man who is planning to take your child sleeps down the hall. And she lay there and let it settle fully. Let the last of whatever softness remained in her, thinking about this situation, go solid and cold and still. She's not that person anymore. She gave that up when she married me. She breathed slowly. She had not given it up. She had simply set it down for a while. She was picking it back up now, and this time she was not going to put it down again until every account was secured, every document was filed, every chain of evidence was beyond his reach, and her son was safe in a life that Ronan Blackridge had no power to dictate. Closed her eyes. She was not afraid. She was ready. She gave herself 3 days after that night in the hallway. Not because she needed 3 days to decide anything. The decision had already been made. Had been made possibly from the moment she picked up that second phone and read 3 words and a time in the dark. She gave herself 3 days because she was 8.5 months pregnant, and her body had opinions about the pace at which things could move, and because she had learned, in 4 years of financial investigation, that rushing the final assembly of a case was the single most common reason cases fell apart. So she waited. She cooked. She let Ronan put his hand on her belly and talk to their son through the fabric of her nightgown, in the slightly self-conscious way he did, when he thought she was watching, the way that had once made her feel something warm and uncomplicated. She documented. On the 4th day, Nico called her from a number she didn't recognize. "New phone," he said before she could ask. Precautionary. "Don't save this number anywhere. Memorize it." She memorized it. What happened? Nothing yet. But I've been doing some background on Marco Vitale's communication patterns, and there's a pattern that bothers me. He's been making calls to a number registered to a private investigation firm out of New Jersey. 3 calls in the last 2 weeks. She sat down slowly onto the edge of the bed. "You think Ronan is having me watched? I think it's possible someone flagged a change in your routine. Prenatal yoga alibi works once or twice. After that, it starts looking like a pattern." She thought about the drives. The Astoria coffee shop. Calls from the car. How much do you think they have? I don't know. If they've been following you physically, they might have photographs of you meeting with me. That alone isn't damaging you. Meeting your brother is not incriminating. But if they've been watching long enough to see a change in your behavior, then Ronan knows something has shifted, or suspects it, which might amount to the same thing. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below, at the ordinary movement of people and traffic, and she thought about whether any of those people were watching the building back. How long do I have before the documentation is in a form I can hand to an attorney? 72 hours if I push. The Meridian chain is solid. The Delaware entities are solid. I still have 2 gaps in the Connecticut property trail, but I can work around them with what we have. "Push," she said. "And Nico, be careful going home." A short silence. "I know how to be careful. I know you do." "Be more careful than that." She hung up and stood at the window for another minute. Then she went to the closet and took out the box of pregnancy journals from the top shelf and opened it and removed the notebook from inside and sat on the floor with her back against the closet door. She still found the floor easier than trying to get up from the low reading chair, and she went through everything she'd written. Every account number, every entity name, every date and amount she'd connected to the joint accounts. She had more than she'd realized. When you write things down in fragments over weeks, you don't always see the accumulation. Looking at it all at once now, she could see the shape of it clearly. So not just a cheating husband hiding money, but a systematic, deliberate architecture of concealment that had been under construction for years, before they were married, possibly. The Delaware entities went back further than Meridian. Some of the Cayman registrations predated her prenuptial agreement, which meant the prenuptial financial disclosures had been fraudulent. She held that thought. A fraudulent prenuptial agreement under New York law was potentially voidable in its entirety. If a party failed to disclose assets at the time of execution deliberately, materially the non-disclosing party could seek to have the entire agreement set aside, which meant the protections Ronan had built into that document to limit her entitlements in the event of divorce might be worth nothing. She wrote that down. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard the elevator open. It was not the time she expected Ronan. He usually came home between 7 and 8, and it was just past 5. She stood up quickly, too quickly, her back seizing in protest, and shoved the notebook into the box, and got the box back onto the shelf, and closed the closet door, and made it to the reading chair 3 seconds, before Ronan appeared in the doorway. He was wearing his coat still. He hadn't stopped to take it off in the foyer. He was looking at his phone as he came in, and he didn't notice immediately that she was watching him rather than reading. And for those 2 seconds before he looked up, she had the rare experience of seeing him without his awareness of being seen. He looked tired. Not the tired of a long day, the tired of a man carrying something he hadn't put down in a long time. Then he looked up and saw her, and something shifted into place in his expression. The tiredness didn't disappear, but it organized itself around the familiar version of himself that he wore for her. "You're home early," she said. Meeting got moved. He came in and sat on the edge of the ottoman near her chair and loosened his tie. "How was your day?" "Slow. My back." He nodded. He reached over and put his hand on her knee briefly in the gesture that meant "I hear you" without requiring more words. Then his phone buzzed and he looked at it and stood. "Take this," he said. "I'll be in the study." She watched him go. She listened to the study door close. She waited 4 minutes, then got up and went to the kitchen and ran the tap for a glass of water, which put her in the hallway adjacent to the study. The door was fully closed this time. She couldn't hear words, only the cadence of his voice, quick, clipped, the rhythm of a man relaying information rather than receiving it. It lasted 6 minutes. When he came out, he didn't come to the kitchen. He went straight to the bedroom. She heard the sound of the closet. Drawers. She walked to the bedroom doorway. He had his go-bag out, the compact black duffel he kept packed for trips that came up without much notice, which was more common in their life than it would be in most. He was adding to it a second jacket, his travel documents wallet. "You're going somewhere," she said. "Something came up in Vienna. I have to fly out tonight." He didn't look up. "I'm sorry." "I know the timing is terrible." She looked at the bag. She looked at him. She thought about the private investigation firm in New Jersey. She thought about 3 calls in 2 weeks. How long? 4 days, maybe 5. He finally looked at her. "You'll have Petra, and I'll have my phone, Ronan." He stopped. "Is everything okay?" she said. She made her voice soft. Slightly worried in the domestic, wifely way he expected. Not the question she was actually asking. Something moved across his face. "Business thing." Complicated, but manageable." He crossed the room and put both hands on her face, which was something he did when he wanted her full attention and wanted her to feel the weight of his. "I would not leave if I thought for 1 second you weren't safe here. You know that." She looked up at him. "I know," she said. He kissed her forehead. He finished packing. He called the car from the foyer, and he kissed her again at the elevator, and he said 4 days, 5 at most, and then the doors closed, and he was gone. Camille stood in the foyer for 30 seconds. Then she called Nico. "He just left for Vienna," she said, unscheduled. Pause. "That's potentially good for us. Or it means he's moving something before I can. Is the documentation ready?" I said 72 hours, Cammy. That was 40 minutes ago. "Can you do it in 48? She heard him blow out a long breath. "I'll try. But listen, if he's moving assets, If this trip is cover for restructuring something, we may not have 48 hours. We may have less. Then tell me what we can act on right now. Tonight, what do I have legitimate authority over that I can do something with immediately? The joint investment account at Hargrove Capital. You have equal signing authority. The balance as of Monday was approximately 4.3 million. She closed her eyes briefly. What else? The household operating account smaller, maybe 300,000 combined. The Connecticut property in your grandmother's name is already protected. That's separate. And there's the Meridian connection. You have a credible spousal claim, but you can't unilaterally access that without legal action. What about the Delaware entities? The ones connected to the joint account transfers? I've sent that documentation to an attorney. Elena Marsh, she's a forensic family law attorney. She's handled cases with this kind of hidden asset structure before. She's reviewed the preliminary materials and she wants to talk to you. Tonight, if possible. Send me her number. Already sent. Camille, she also said that given what we've found, there may be an obligation to report certain findings to financial authorities. The Meridian transaction history I know. It's not just divorce territory anymore. I know, Nico. I've known that for 2 weeks. She hung up and called Elena Marsh. Elena Marsh had the voice of someone who had been in too many rooms where men underestimated her and had long since stopped taking it personally. She was direct in the way that people who charge by the hour learn to be direct, no preamble, no cushioning. I've looked at what your brother sent me, Elena said. I have questions, and I want to be clear about some things before we go further. Is this line secure? As secure as I can make it. All right. The Meridian documentation is strong. The Delaware entities are strong. The fraudulent prenuptial disclosure angle is potentially the most powerful piece because it touches everything. It doesn't just affect asset division. It potentially voids the protections he built in about legal costs and debt allocation. If we can establish material non-disclosure at the time of signing, we can seek to have the entire agreement invalidated. What do you need from me? I need a sworn affidavit from you, documenting your knowledge of assets concealed at the time of the prenuptial signing. I need the original prenuptial document and the financial disclosure schedules attached to it. And I need to know how much time we have before he comes back. 4 days, possibly less. A brief silence. Then we need to file for emergency protective orders on the joint assets before he returns. Freeze them in place before he can move them. That requires going in front of a judge, which means tomorrow morning. Camille pressed her hand flat against the kitchen counter. Tomorrow morning. She was 36 weeks pregnant, and tomorrow morning she would have to sit in front of a judge and begin the legal process of dismantling her marriage, while her husband was somewhere over the Atlantic, believing she was at home waiting for him. Okay, she said. There's one more thing, Elena said. The financial irregularities in Meridian's transaction records the ones that go beyond asset concealment into potential criminal territory. If we introduce that documentation in civil proceedings, it will likely trigger a referral. Do you understand what that means for him? Yes. And you're prepared for that. It was not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. It was the kind of thing a careful attorney said when she wanted to make sure her client had looked at the full shape of the road ahead. I'm prepared, Camille said, for whatever protects my son. There was a pause. Then, good, I'll see you at 8 tomorrow morning. That night, Camille did not sleep. She sat in the reading room with the notebook and went through everything. One more time, checking her own work, looking for gaps, for anything she'd misread or overestimated. At some point after midnight, she got up and made tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the lights of the city below. All of it continuing, indifferent, enormous. She thought about the moment at the Beaumont Hotel, the elevator doors closing. She thought about she's not that person anymore. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass, feeling the cold of it, the realness of it. At 3 a.m, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Not Nico's new number. Completely unknown. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. Silence on the other end for 2 seconds. Then a woman's voice, low, slightly unsteady. Is this Camille? She went still. Who is this? My name is Celeste. A pause. Celeste Arden. The kitchen felt very quiet. Camille set her tea down carefully on the counter. Why are you calling me? Because I found out something tonight that you need to know. The woman's voice was tighter now. Controlled but barely. Something he told me that I didn't know it was. She stopped. Started again. He told me you knew about us. He said you'd known for months and you'd agreed to a private arrangement. That the marriage was effectively over already and you'd both agreed to be. That's not true, Camille said. A sharp intake of breath. I know that now. That's why I'm calling. How did you get this number? I looked you up. It took me a while. There's almost nothing about you publicly. He made sure of that. Her voice caught slightly on the last words, and Camille heard in it the particular sound of someone processing something ugly about a person they had not yet finished loving. She felt something unexpected move through her. Not sympathy exactly. Not its absence either. What was it you found out? Camille said. He was on the phone tonight. I heard part of it. He didn't know I was in the other room. He was talking to someone about a custody evaluation. About having documentation that you were mentally unstable. That you'd been showing signs of paranoid behavior during the pregnancy. A pause. He's been keeping records. Of things you've said. Things you've done. He has someone, a doctor, I think. Someone who's agreed to provide a clinical assessment saying, you're not fit. Camille's hand tightened on the phone until she felt the case creak slightly. He's been building that case. Celeste continued, voice dropping lower, for at least 3 months. It's not he wasn't going to fight you for the baby, because he wanted the baby. He was going to use the baby to make sure you couldn't afford to fight him on anything else. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere far below, a car alarm went off and then stopped. Celeste, Camille said carefully. Does he know you heard this? No, he's asleep. I left. Where are you now? A hotel. I needed to not be there. And I needed to call you because I didn't know. I didn't know any of it, I thought. Her voice broke slightly and she stopped. When she spoke again, it was flat with the effort of keeping it controlled. I know this doesn't fix anything. I know that. I just needed you to know. Camille stood in her kitchen at 3 a.m. and absorbed this. A bought doctor. A manufactured psychiatric record. 3 months of documentation designed to paint her as unstable, paranoid, unfit. Filed in a court, in the hands of the right judge. The kind of judge a man with Ronan's resources could position himself in front of it would be enough to delay, obstruct, complicate. Long enough for him to move the assets. Long enough to establish primary custody before her own legal case had traction. She thought about Elena Marsh. She thought about the appointment at 8 a.m. If Ronan found out she had met with an attorney before that appointment happened, if he knew she was moving, really moving, he would accelerate. He would freeze her out of accounts directly, rather than slowly, use the legal machinery he'd already prepared, use the psychiatric documentation as a shield. She had hours, not days. Hours, Celeste, she said. I need you to listen to me very carefully. A pause. Okay. Are you willing to speak with my attorney? A longer pause. About what I heard. About what you heard. About what you know. About the timeline of your involvement with my husband and any conversations you had with him about me or our marriage or our finances. Any of it. The silence stretched. If I do that, Celeste said slowly, he'll know I. Yes. He's not someone you cross easily. I know that better than you do, Camille said. But I also know something about him that you may not have fully understood yet. He doesn't protect people. He uses them and he builds contingencies for when they become inconvenient. You heard him tonight. That was the real version of him. You should decide which version of this you want to be part of. Another silence. Long enough that Camille thought she might have lost her. Then, send me the attorney's information. Camille closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. I'll send it in the next 5 minutes, she said. Stay where you are. Don't contact him. Don't let him know where you are tonight. She hung up and immediately called Nico. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy but present. What happened? Ronan has a bought psychiatric evaluation prepared. He's been building a record for 3 months to have me declared unfit. Silence. Then, very quietly, that son of a I need the documentation ready in 12 hours, not 48. Everything we have, in a form Elena Marsh, can file first thing in the morning. And I need you to add one more thing to the package. What? Documentation of the psychiatric fraud. If he's used a medical professional to produce a fabricated clinical assessment for use in legal proceedings, that's witness tampering and potentially fraud on the court. Yes. She heard him sit up fully. She heard the shift of sheets, then his feet on the floor. Do you have the name of the doctor? Not yet, but I may have a source. Celeste Arden. How did you? Because it's the only variable that changed tonight. He was already moving on his end. She could hear him. Okay, I'm going to be awake for the rest of the night. You should try to sleep. I can't. You're 36 weeks pregnant, Camille. Your body is not optional. I'll lie down, she said. I won't sleep. That's the best I can do right now. She did lie down. She lay on top of the covers, with her shoes still on and her phone on the pillow beside her. And she stared at the ceiling and thought through the order of operations, with the methodical precision she'd trained herself to maintain under pressure, years ago in a conference room, being told that the case she'd spent 8 months. Mundrum said, building had a gap that might not be closable in time. She had closed it then, she would close this. The difference was that then she'd had institutional backing, team, resources, and legal cover. Now she had her brother on a burner phone, an attorney she'd spoken to once, and a woman who had been sleeping with her husband and might change her mind about cooperating before morning. At 5:30 she got up and showered and put on the most composed version of her current wardrobe, which was limited by the reality of being 9 days from her due date. She made coffee she shouldn't drink and drank half of it anyway, and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open. At 6:15 her phone rang. Ronan. She answered it on the second ring. Morning. His voice was clear, not tired. He'd slept wherever he was. How are you feeling? Tired. My back kept me up. True. Technically entirely true. How was the flight? Long. I'm about to go into a meeting. I just wanted to check in before it started. A pause. Petra's coming today this afternoon. Good. Another pause. Something in the rhythm of the call felt slightly off to her, not quite the usual morning check-in. Slightly more deliberate. Camille, I want you to stay close to home today. With the due date coming up, I'd feel better knowing you weren't. I wasn't planning to go anywhere, she said, evenly. Pleasantly. Good. The word came out with a fractional exhale underneath it, the sound of a man who got the answer he was hoping for. I'll call tonight. Travel safe, she said. She hung up. She picked up her keys and her bag and the folder of documents she'd spent the night organizing, and she rode the elevator down to the lobby, nodded to the doorman, walked out into the cold October morning, hailed a cab on the corner, and gave Elena Marsh's office address. She did not look back at the building. There was nothing behind her anymore. At 8 o'clock, she sat across from Elena Marsh in an office on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown, and she laid the notebook on the desk and slid it across and watched the attorney open it. Elena Marsh read in silence for 4 minutes. She turned pages steadily, without expression, with the focused neutrality of someone who had learned not to react visibly until she had the full picture. Camille sat across from her and kept her hands flat on the arms of the chair and breathed. At the end of the 4th minute, Elena closed the notebook. She looked up at Camille. I want to be very clear with you about something, she said. What you've brought me today is not a divorce case. What you've brought me is a multi-front legal action involving concealed marital assets, fraudulent prenuptial disclosure, potential criminal financial conduct, and the manufactured psychiatric record you described on the phone last night. Each of those pieces individually is significant. Together, she paused. Together, this is going to be one of the largest and most complicated marital asset cases I've seen in 20 years of practice. And it's going to move very fast once we file, which means whatever is about to happen will not be quiet, and it will not be slow. I know, Camille said. Elena studied her for a moment. You're ready for that. It was the same question she'd asked the night before, but in the morning light, in this office, with the notebook sitting between them, it landed differently. It landed like the actual threshold that it was. Camille thought about the hallway. The study door, she's not that person anymore. She thought about her son, 36 weeks developed, who would be born in days into whatever world she built right now. She sat up straight in the chair. File everything, she said. Elena Marsh picked up her phone and called her paralegal and began to speak in the rapid, precise shorthand of someone who had been waiting for exactly this instruction. And Camille sat up across from her and listened to the engine of it begin to turn and felt the last door she could have walked back through, close, quietly, and permanently behind her. She was not the woman Ronan had decided she was. She was not the woman who had set herself aside. She was someone he had made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating for 6 years while she paid very close attention. And what came next was not revenge, and it was not grief, and it was not the desperate action of a woman running out of options. It was the most focused and considered thing she had ever done. And it had only just begun. The filing took 4 hours. Camille sat in Elena Marsh's conference room while the paralegal team worked, and she answered questions when asked, signed documents when they were put in front of her, and drank 3 glasses of water because her body had opinions about the morning that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. Her back was a continuous low complaint. The baby had dropped in the last week, shifted lower, and the pressure of it made sitting in a hard chair for extended periods something she was managing rather than tolerating. She managed. At 11:47, Elena came back into the conference room with a printout in her hand and set it on the table in front of Camille. Emergency motion filed, she said. Temporary restraining order on all jointly held marital assets pending full hearing. We have a judge who will review it this afternoon. She sat down across from Camille. We've also filed a petition to invalidate the prenuptial agreement on grounds of material non-disclosure, with the Meridian documentation and the Delaware entity chain attached as exhibits. That's going to take longer to work through, but it establishes the record. And the psychiatric fraud? I've sent a separate referral to the New York State Medical Licensing Board with a request for investigation into the physician named in the documents your brother traced. We don't have the full clinical assessment Ronan commissioned. We have references to it and some circumstantial connection to the physician, but it's enough to open an inquiry. And if Celeste Arden's testimonies corroborates the phone call she overheard, she'll cooperate, Camille said. She was not entirely certain of this, but she said it firmly because certainty, even performed certainty, had a way of becoming real if you held it long enough. Elena looked at her steadily. When Ronan is served with these filings, which will happen today, through his attorney of record, he's going to know immediately that the window he thought he had is closed. He's going to react. I know, he has resources and connections that most people in this situation don't have. The legal machinery we're engaging is solid, but he will try to counter-move. He may attempt to access or transfer assets before the TRO is fully enforced. He may attempt to Elena paused. He may attempt to make this uncomfortable for you in ways that go beyond the courtroom. Camille looked at her. Are you asking me if I'm afraid of him? I'm asking you if you're prepared for the full scope of how a man in his position responds when he's cornered. She thought about the Mafia King she'd watched from across a hotel lobby. She thought about Marco Vitale's voice through a half-open door. She thought about a bought doctor and 3 months of manufactured psychiatric records. He's been cornering me for 6 years, she said. He just didn't announce it. Elena held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. All right. There are some additional steps I want to take on the security side, documenting your location, establishing a check-in protocol with my office. If you have somewhere other than the penthouse you can stay, I'll handle that. Camille, I said I'll handle it. She said it evenly, without edge, but Elena heard the boundary in it and didn't push. At 12:30, Camille walked out of the building into midday Manhattan. The air hit her cold and sharp and smelling of exhaust and something faintly like rain coming, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her bag over one shoulder and her hand pressed to the underside of her belly out of habit, and she breathed. Then she called Nico. It's filed, she said. She heard him exhale. A long, controlled breath. Okay, good. How are you feeling? Like I need to not be at the penthouse when Ronan's attorney calls him. Yeah. A pause. Come to me, are you sure? If anyone is watching your place? I swept it this morning. I do it regularly now. Come here. His voice had the tone it took when he wasn't going to negotiate the point. You shouldn't be alone today, Camille. I don't care how capable you are. You shouldn't be alone today. She took a cab to his apartment in Long Island City. He buzzed her up, and when she came through the door, he looked at her face and then pulled her into the same too tight hug as before. And this time, she let herself lean into it for a moment instead of managing it. You look terrible, he said into her hair. Thank you, Nico. I mean it. When did you last eat something real? Yesterday dinner. He made a sound that conveyed his opinion of that and steered her toward the kitchen. His apartment was small and extremely organized in the way of someone who thinks spatially everything in designated places, cables managed, monitors at specific angles. The kind of space that would read as sparse to some people and as precise to anyone who understood that clutter was cognitive load he chose not to carry. He made her a sandwich she didn't ask for and put it on the counter in front of her and stood against the opposite counter with his arms crossed while she ate it, watching her in the way older brothers watch their younger sisters when they've been scared and don't want to say so. She ate the sandwich. Tell me what happens next, she said between bites. Ronan's attorney gets served sometime this afternoon. Ronan finds out within minutes of that happening. The TRO on the joint assets kicks in the banks have already been notified, which is part of the filing. He won't be able to move money out of those accounts unilaterally. He paused. The accounts he controls separately, the ones under the entities, those are a different situation. We can't freeze those through the civil filing. Those would require a criminal financial hold, which requires involvement from federal investigators. Yes, she finished the sandwich. She pushed the plate aside. Elena made a referral yesterday on the money laundering question. Nico was quiet for a moment. How much of the Meridian documentation did you include? All of it. He nodded slowly. Then it's moving. It'll take time for them to build their own case independently, but it's moving. How much time? Weeks, maybe. Months for the full picture. But the initial inquiry that starts fast, especially if what I found in the transaction records is as clear as I think it is. He looked at her. The people who run money through legitimate real estate portfolios are not subtle in the way they think they are. They're subtle relative to non-experts. They're not subtle to people who know what they're looking at. And you know what you're looking at. I know what I'm looking at, he confirmed. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Elena Marsh. She answered. He's been served, Elena said. No preamble. 40 minutes ago, through his New York attorney. I'm told the attorney's office made contact with Ronan personally via phone, approximately 15 minutes after that. Which means he knows. Camille looked at the wall. And his attorney filed an immediate counter-motion. They had something pre-prepared, which tells us they weren't entirely caught off guard by the idea of legal action, just by the timing and scope of it. The counter-motion challenges the basis for the TRO and requests an expedited hearing. A brief pause. They also filed something I didn't anticipate. She waited. A motion for an emergency custody evaluation. They're claiming, and I want to be very direct with you about what this says, they're claiming that you are exhibiting signs of prenatal psychological instability that represent a risk to the unborn child's welfare. And they're requesting that the court appoint a guardian ad litem to represent the child's interests in all proceedings until birth. Kitchen was very still. Nico was watching her face. She was aware of her own breathing. In, out, in. The way she'd practiced in the yoga class where she'd sat in the back and stared at the floor and thought about shell companies. They're using the psychiatric record, she said. They've submitted a clinical assessment from a doctor. Harlan Pfeiffer, a psychiatrist with a practice in Connecticut. The assessment is dated 10 days ago and claims to document a pattern of paranoid ideation, emotional dysregulation, and delusional thinking, his words observed over multiple consultations. Elena's voice was controlled, but Camille could hear the tightness underneath it. This assessment has never been disclosed to you. You've never met this physician. No, Camille said. I have not. They've also attached, and this is the part I need you to hear, they've attached a log. A personal log, It appears to be Ronan's handwriting, digitized, dating back 4 months, documenting incidents, arguments, things you said, behaviors he characterizes as evidence of instability. Yes, she thought about the evenings she'd been in the reading room, the nights she'd been on the floor of the closet with the notebook, whether there were cameras she hadn't thought to check for, whether he had been watching her watch him. Elena, she said, how does a forged psychiatric assessment produced by a physician who has never actually examined his patient survive contact with the licensing board referral we filed? It may not. But in the short term, in the next 48 to 72 hours, before a judge rules on either of these competing motions, it creates a narrative that a judge will have to weigh. And if Ronan's attorney can get in front of the right judge before our TRO is confirmed. Judge shopping. Possibly we're watching for it. A pause. I need you to stay somewhere secure tonight. Not the penthouse. Not anywhere Ronan has physical access to. I'm with my brother. Good. Stay there. Don't go home. And Camille, if you experience any symptoms that might indicate labor is beginning, you go to the hospital immediately regardless of what else is happening legally. Do you understand? Yes. She hung up. Nico had heard enough from her end to understand the shape of it. He uncrossed his arms and came to the kitchen island and put both hands flat on it and looked at her. The psychiatric evaluation. Yes, so he had it ready. He was waiting to use it. He was waiting until after the birth. We moved faster than he expected. She pressed her palm flat on the counter, too. It was cold granite, real and solid. He accelerated it. Which means he's rattled. Which means he's rattled and dangerous. Those are not the same as beaten. She pushed off from the counter. I need to make one more call. She went to the small guest room Nico had cleared for her, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she called Celeste Arden. Celeste answered on the first ring, which told Camille she'd been sitting with her phone, waiting for it to ring. Talk to him? Camille asked. He called twice. I didn't answer. Her voice was tighter than it had been at 3 in the morning. The kind of tight that came from a long morning of sitting with a decision you'd made at 3 a. And not entirely regretted yet, but were beginning to examine more closely. I need you to speak with my attorney today. Not tomorrow. Today, I know. I said I would, Celeste. Camille kept her voice even. Not warm, exactly, but not cold. I understand that this is not a position you expected to be in. I understand that whatever he told you about me and our marriage, you believed it because he's convincing. I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me. I'm asking you to tell an attorney what you heard on that phone call, because what he's doing right now, what he filed this morning, could result in me losing access to my own child. Silence on the other end. Then he filed something? A motion claiming I'm mentally unfit, supported by a psychiatric evaluation from a doctor I've never met. A short, sharp sound from Celeste's end that might have been a breath, or might have been something she stopped herself from saying. He told me about Pfeiffer, she said quietly. I didn't. I thought he said it was a precautionary measure. That you'd been struggling with the pregnancy psychologically, and he was worried about the baby. And you believed him. I believed him. The words came out flat and exhausted. I believed a lot of things. Then help me prove what's actually true. A long pause. Camille could hear traffic from wherever Celeste was. A window open, maybe. The ordinary sounds of a city continuing. What time does your attorney need me? Celeste said. Camille exhaled. I'll find out and text you. She called Elena. She texted Celeste. She lay back on the guest bed and stared at the ceiling and put one hand on her belly and felt her son move a slow, steady pressure, like someone pushing from the inside, just to make sure she knew he was there. I know, she said quietly. We're okay. She did not entirely believe it yet, but she was working on it. At 4 in the afternoon, Nico knocked on the guest room door and opened it without waiting. He had his laptop in one hand, and his expression had shifted into something she recognized and didn't like, the focused stillness he got when something required being said that neither of them was going to enjoy. Talk, she said. He set the laptop on the bed beside her and turned it so she could see the screen. It was a set of transaction records, recent, time-stamped from the last 3 hours. He moved money, she said. Not a question. The accounts under the entities, the ones we couldn't touch with, the TRO, he's been restructuring them since approximately 1 hour after he was served. Wire transfers to accounts I can't immediately trace. One of the Meridian subsidiaries has been dissolved. He pointed at a line on the screen. This one, the Connecticut property holding, he's initiated a title transfer, trying to move it to a new entity before the court can include it in the asset freeze. Can that transfer be stopped? Elena's filing an emergency motion to block it as we speak. Whether it gets in front of a judge before the transfer completes. He shook his head. Maybe. Depends on timing. She sat up. Her cat screamed. She ignored it. What about the Meridian criminal referral? Can the federal inquiry put a hold on the entity transfers? If they move on it quickly, potentially yes. But federal inquiries don't move in hours, Camille. They move in days at the fastest. She looked at the transaction records. She looked at the dissolution notice on the subsidiary. She thought about the architecture she'd spent weeks mapping all those entities, all those threads, and now Ronan pulling them like loose strings, trying to unravel the whole thing before the legal system could get its hands on it. She thought about something Elena had said. He has resources that most people in this situation don't have. She thought about something else, something she'd been holding in reserve because it felt like a nuclear option, the kind of thing you didn't use unless everything else had failed, because once you used it, you couldn't unuse it. Nico, she said, the documentation you found in the Meridian transaction records. The full picture, the wire patterns, the currency conversion sequences, the offshore routing. He looked at her carefully. What about it? Is it complete enough to make a referral directly to FinCEN? Not through Elena's filing, not through the standard civil channel. Directly. He was quiet. That's if we do that, it accelerates the federal timeline significantly. FinCEN has authority to issue immediate holds on accounts connected to money laundering investigations. They don't wait for civil proceedings to complete. I know. It also means this goes from a divorce case involving concealed assets to a federal financial crimes investigation. Publicly. There's no quiet version of that, I know. Ronan will know we made that referral, and he will know that he cannot stop what comes after it. That's Camille. That's the point of no return on a different scale. That's not just ending the marriage. That's ending him, she said. Yes, I know. She looked at her brother. He was going to take my son and manufacture evidence to make me look insane and pay a doctor to sign his name to a lie. He was going to use my child as a weapon and walk away with the money and leave me with nothing. She stopped. She started again, more quietly. Tell me there's another option. Nico looked at the laptop screen. He looked at her. There isn't, he said. She nodded. Make the referral, she said. He sat down on the bed and opened a secure browser and began to type, and Camille sat next to him and watched, and neither of them said anything while he worked. It took 11 minutes. When it was done, Nico closed the laptop, put it on the floor. He sat beside his sister in the quiet guest room, and they were both still for a moment. There's no coming back from that, he said. I know. Whatever he had left the organization, the connections, the protection, the federal attention is going to pull all of it apart. I know, Nico. He looked at her sideways. She could feel it without looking back. Are you okay? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. But I will be. That's different. He put his arm around her shoulders awkward, because of the baby. Everything physical was awkward now, and she leaned into it, and they sat there in the quiet while outside. The light shifted toward evening, and somewhere across the East River, the city continued its own. Enormous life, completely indifferent to any of this. She got 3 hours of sleep that night. Not because she wasn't exhausted. She was exhausted in a bone-deep way that went beyond tired into something that needed more than sleep to fix. But her mind would not stop running the variables. The TRO hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. Celeste's testimony, which Elena had recorded and documented in a sworn statement that afternoon, Celeste sitting across from the attorney in a conference room and telling the full story in a flat, steady voice that Elena had described as credible and devastating. The FinCEN referral, acknowledged within 2 hours by an automated response that told them nothing specific except that it had been received and logged. And Ronan, somewhere she didn't know exactly where, and that bothered her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. He'd been in Vienna, but he could have boarded a flight the moment his attorney called him. He could be in New York right now. He could be at the penthouse. He could be doing things she wasn't watching. At 2 in the morning, she got up and went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water and stood at the window. Nico's neighborhood was quiet at this hour, low buildings, street lights, the occasional car. Her phone buzzed. Ronan. She looked at the screen for 3 rings. She answered, "Where are you?" Not hello. Not her name. Just those 3 words in a voice she'd never quite heard from him, before stripped of the professional smoothness, stripped of the warmth he applied, like a coat he could take, on and off. Just the raw voice underneath. "That's not something I'm going to tell you," she said. A silence. She heard him breathe. "Camille, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. Whatever your attorney has filed, whatever she's told you, you don't understand the full picture of what you're touching. You don't understand what happens when you—" "I understand it perfectly," she said. "You don't." His voice sharpened. "The people connected to these accounts, the structure of what you're trying to disrupt, there are people involved who are not going to sit quietly while a federal referral moves through the system. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" She understood. He was telling her, in the language he used when he was being genuine about something, that she was in physical danger, that the organization she was unraveling had people in it who did not solve problems with attorneys. She felt the fear move through her. She let it. She didn't push it down or rationalize it away. She stood in her brother's kitchen at 2 in the morning and felt afraid, properly and completely, and let it pass through her like weather. "Ronan," she said, "I want you to listen to me carefully." Silence. "Everything I've filed, everything I've sent, every document and transaction record and piece of correspondence, every single piece of it has been duplicated and secured in locations that are not accessible to you or anyone connected to you. My attorney has copies. A federal repository has copies. There are copies held by a third party outside the country who has instructions to release them publicly and to additional authorities if I fail to check in within specified intervals." She paused. "You cannot solve this by scaring me. You cannot solve this by having someone follow me or threaten me or make me feel like I have no options. The only thing you will accomplish by going that direction is making everything worse for yourself." A very long silence. "Where's the baby?" he said. His voice had changed again. "Quieter," something she didn't fully recognize. "Safe," she said. "We're both safe." "Camille, stop." She said it firmly. Not loud. "You should talk to your attorney. That's all there is to say right now." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen, and her hands were shaking not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the particular adrenaline of having said the true thing directly to someone who had power over you and not taking it back. She pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed until the shaking stopped. Then she went back to the guest room and lay down, and eventually, somewhere near 4 in the morning, she slept. She woke at 6:45 to Nico standing in the doorway. His face was the careful kind of neutral that meant he had information and was deciding how to give it to her. She sat up. "Say it." FISN issued a provisional hold on 14 accounts connected to the Meridian Entity Network. Effective as of 6 this morning. She stared at him. "That fast?" "Whatever I found in those transaction records, they recognized it. They had context for it that we didn't. I think the Meridian Network was already on someone's radar, and our referral was the thread they needed." He crossed his arms. "It's not a full freeze yet. Provisional means they have 72 hours to decide whether to escalate to a full investigative hold. But right now, this morning, the money that Ronan was moving yesterday is locked." She pressed both hands over her face and held them there for a moment. "There's more," Nico said. She lowered her hands, looked at him. 2 of Ronan's known associates, men connected to the organization, were picked up by federal agents at 5 this morning. Different locations. I don't have details on why yet, but one of them is Marco Vitale. Marco Vitale, the consigliere, the man whose voice she'd heard through the half-open study door. The timing makes sense. After the birth, when she's recovering. She sat with that for a moment. He's losing his protection, she said quietly. Yes. When the people around him start getting picked up, the ones who haven't been picked up yet start making decisions about whether to cooperate with the people doing the picking up. That's generally how it works. She got up. Her back was the worst it had been. She put one hand on the wall and breathed through it. Nico took a half step toward her, and she shook her head slightly, and he stopped. TRO hearing is in 2 hours, she said. Yes. I need to get dressed. She got dressed. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, putting on her shoes, the one remaining pair that still fit properly. A pair of flat boots she'd bought in the last trimester when her phone buzzed. Elena Marsh, she answered. The TRO has been confirmed, Elena said. The judge reviewed the full filing this morning. All jointly held marital assets are frozen pending full hearing. Ronan's counter-motion was denied. A pause, and then something underneath the attorney's professional tone that might have been satisfaction. Also been served this morning with the invalidation petition on the prenuptial agreement. His attorney called my office 12 minutes ago to request a settlement conversation. Camille stopped with one boot in her hand. A settlement conversation, she said. Yes, he wants to negotiate. His attorney is using the word conversation. But yes. She thought about the phone call at 2 in the morning. The stripped-down voice. You don't understand what happens when you. He was afraid, not of her, not exactly not yet, but of what she'd set in motion. Of the FinCEN holds he didn't know about yet, or maybe he did by now. Of Marco being picked up at 5 in the morning. Of the structure he'd spent 15 years building, showing for the first time real cracks. Tell his attorney, Camille said, slowly, that I'm willing to have a settlement conversation. But it happens on my terms. My location, my attorney present, and Ronan comes without his own security. Just him and his attorney. He won't agree to those conditions. He'll think about it, she said, and while he's thinking, we proceed with everything exactly as filed. Don't pause anything. Understood. A pause. Are you all right? You sound. I'm fine, she said. I'm getting dressed. She put the boot on. She stood up. Nico was in the doorway again. He'd heard her end of it. Settlement conversation? He wants an exit, she said. He wants to negotiate something that lets him keep enough to feel like he didn't lose completely. Are you going to give him that? She picked up her bag. She looked at her brother. I'm going to make him believe it's possible, long enough to get everything I need in writing. She walked out of the guest room and through the apartment toward the front door, and Nico followed, and neither of them said anything as they went down in the elevator and out into the cold morning. It was the kind of cold that committed to itself. Sharp and clear, no ambiguity in it. The sky was high and pale, and the streets were already busy with the particular energy of a city that didn't stop moving, regardless of what was happening in any individual life inside it. She stood on the sidewalk outside Nico's building for a moment. She was 37 weeks pregnant, and she had not slept properly in 4 days, and her back hurt in a way she was running out of vocabulary to describe. And somewhere in this city, a man was sitting with his attorney trying to figure out how much. He had to surrender to survive what she'd started. She thought about a night 6 weeks ago, a second phone. 3 words and a time. She thought about standing in the dark hallway holding a glass of water, while the voice of her husband described how he planned to take her child and destroy her credibility and walk away clean. She thought about her son. She pulled her coat around herself and put her hand flat against the side of her belly, where she could feel the particular shape of him, the compressed reality of another person who was almost ready to be in the world, who had no idea what the world he was about to enter looked like yet, and was counting on her, entirely and without reservation, to make it worth entering. Her phone buzzed. Elena Marsh again, she answered. His attorney called back, Elena said. Already? He agrees to your conditions. Camille stood on the sidewalk and looked at the pale morning sky. He was coming, not from a position of strength he was coming, because the ground had disappeared under him, and he needed to talk to the woman who'd removed it. He was going to sit across from her and look at her and try to find the version of her he thought he knew, the one who set herself aside, the one who had forgotten what she was. He was going to find someone else entirely. Send me the address, she said. We'll be there at noon. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at Nico. He looked back at her. In his face, she could see everything. He wasn't saying the fear he'd been carrying since she called him from the car, weeks ago, the anger at Ronan that he'd been sitting on with great effort, the love underneath all of it that had driven him to stay up all night, for weeks running searches on accounts and entities and filing structures for a man he'd never trusted. Ready, he said. She thought about what was waiting at noon. Ronan across a table, his attorney beside him. Everything that had been between them for 6 years, reduced to the legal language of what each party was entitled to walk away with. She thought about the FinCEN holds that Ronan didn't yet know the full scope of. The 14 accounts locked this morning. The federal investigation that was no longer theoretical. The organization he'd built beginning to fold inward on itself, as the people inside it made the calculations that people always made when the structure protecting them started to come apart. She thought about what it meant to walk into that room at noon, knowing what she knew, and letting him believe, for as long as it was useful, that there was something left to negotiate. She straightened. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Yes, she said. They walked toward the subway, and behind them the street continued its morning, and overhead the pale sky held its cold light without opinion. And Camille Varela moved through it all, with the particular focus of a woman who had run out of time for anything except exactly what came next. And what came next was the room where Ronan Blackridge was going to sit across from his pregnant wife for the last time, and finally, for the first time, see clearly who she had always been. The subway entrance was half a block ahead. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Not the one Celeste had used. Not Nico's burner. Completely unknown, she answered. Nothing for 2 seconds. Then a man's voice. Quiet. Unhurried. The voice of someone who was accustomed to not needing to rush anything. Mrs. Blackridge, the voice said. My name is not important right now. What is important is that you understand, before your noon meeting, that there are aspects of your husband's business arrangements that extend beyond what your brother's research has found. People with significant interests in those arrangements. People who are not represented in any of the documentation you've filed. A pause. People who would prefer that the current legal proceedings resolve in a particular direction. She kept walking. She did not slow her pace. In what direction is that? Quietly, the man said, and quickly. For everyone's benefit, including yours and your son's. She looked straight ahead. The subway entrance was coming up. Beside her, Nico glanced at her face and registered something in it, and his own expression shifted. I think, Camille said into the phone, her voice completely level, that you should speak with my attorney. She hung up. She kept walking. Nico grabbed her arm. Who was that? She looked at him. In her chest, her heart was doing something loud and insistent that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with what that call had just confirmed that there were people in this she hadn't fully mapped. People with interests she didn't entirely understand. People for whom the legal proceedings she'd set in motion were not just Ronan's problem but their own. Someone Ronan owes something to, she said, or someone he borrowed something from. Someone who is worried about what a federal investigation uncovers beyond Meridian. Camille Nico said it in the specific tone of a man who needed her to stop walking and look at him. She stopped. She looked at him. This just changed, he said. Yes, this is not just a divorce case with complicated asset issues. There are people involved who I know. She held his gaze. It was always going to lead here. I think I knew that when I found the Delaware entities. I just needed to know it fully before I could say it out loud. He stared at her. What do we do? She looked back toward the subway. She thought about noon. She thought about Ronan, sitting across from her with his attorney, trying to build a quiet exit. She thought about the voice on the phone. People who are not represented in any of the documentation you've filed. Which meant there was more documentation to find. Which meant the meeting at noon was not the end of this. It was not even the beginning of the end. It was the moment where she walked into a room knowing things Ronan didn't know she knew, and used what was on the table to find out what was still off it. And whatever she found off it Whatever names and accounts and arrangements had not yet surfaced in the documentation, she was going to need to be very, very careful about what she did with it next. We go to the meeting, she said, with what we know now. After that call, especially with what we know now, she met his eyes. Because that call tells me he's more scared than I realized. And scared people make mistakes in rooms where they think they have the upper hand. She pulled her coat closed against the cold. We go to the meeting, and we listen, and we watch, and we find out what he thinks he still has to offer. Nico looked at her for a long moment. She could see the war in him, the part that wanted to call this off. Call Elena, call someone with authority and physical presence, and the ability to put her somewhere safe. And the part that knew her well enough to understand that the safe direction and the right direction were not always the same, and that she had already made this calculation more carefully than he had. I'm coming with you, he said. I was counting on it, she said. They went down into the subway, and the doors closed behind them, and the train moved, and above them the city continued without pause. And somewhere across Manhattan in a conference room, with a view Camille had not yet seen, Ronan Blackridge sat with his attorney and did not yet know that the woman he was about to negotiate with had received a phone call 20 minutes ago that had just made the stakes of this meeting vastly larger than either of his attorneys had. Prepared him for, and that she was on her way to him anyway, with everything she had, and she was not going to flinch. The train moved through the dark. Julian moved inside her one sharp, decisive kick, high under her ribs. She put her hand there. She did not speak. She did not need to. Conference room was on the 22nd floor of a building on Park Avenue that Ronan's attorney had chosen, which told Camille something immediately he wanted home ground, or the closest approximation of it available to him, now that so much of what he'd considered home ground had been legally cordoned off. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows facing south, a long table of dark wood, and the particular quality of silence that expensive rooms have, the kind that costs money to maintain. Ronan was already there when she arrived. She had expected that. He would have come early to establish the room as his, to be seated when she entered, to have the small psychological advantage of watching her walk toward him rather than the other way around. She had known him long enough to understand how he thought about those things, the minor architectures of power that men like him built into every interaction without fully realizing they were doing it. She came in with Elena on her left and Nico 2 steps behind, and she did not pause at the door or take in the room with any visible adjustment. She walked to her side of the table and set her bag on the chair beside her and sat down. She looked at Ronan. He looked back. 6 years of marriage, and she was seeing him clearly for what might have been the first time, not because she hadn't looked before, but because what you see in a person depends entirely on what you're looking for. She had spent 6 years looking for the man she loved. She was looking now for something different, and what she saw was a man who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day. Tired in the structural way, the way a building looks tired just before it comes down. He was wearing a suit she recognized. Dark gray, the one he kept for significant meetings. He had shaved carefully. His hands were flat on the table, in front of him, still, in the deliberate way of a man who had told himself before he walked in here to show nothing. He was showing things anyway. She could see them. His attorney, a man named Garrett Fenn, who had been representing Blackridge Capital in civil matters for 11 years, sat beside him with a legal pad and a fountain pen, and the slightly compressed expression of someone who had been managing a very bad week. Elena put a folder on the table in front of Camille and opened it without a word. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Garrett Fenn said. He directed it at Elena, the professional-to-professional opening, the ritual of it. "Let's not do the courtesy exchange," Camille said. Everyone looked at her. "We're here because he needs something," she said. She was looking at Ronan when she said it. He needs the federal referral to go away, or at least to be complicated enough that it loses momentum. He needs the prenuptial invalidation petition to not go forward. He needs something he can characterize as a negotiated resolution rather than a collapse. She kept her voice even. No heat in it, just the shape of the situation stated plainly. So let's start from what's actually true, rather than spending an hour getting there through polite language. Garrett Fenn glanced at Ronan. Ronan was still looking at Camille. His jaw had moved slightly, a small adjustment like something being reset. "You've changed," he said. "No," she said. "You just stopped looking." Silence. Elena put her hand briefly on the folder, but didn't open it further. Nico sat against the wall behind Camille's chair, with his arms crossed, and his face doing nothing. "The FinCEN holds," Garrett Fenn said carefully. "We understand a provisional hold was issued this morning on accounts connected to the Meridian network. 14 accounts," Elena confirmed. "Our position is that the referral underlying that hold was based on incomplete and potentially misleading documentation, and that a full review—" "It wasn't," Nico said from behind them, quietly. "Just that." Garrett Fenn looked at him, looked back at Elena. "The documentation your client provided to FinCEN was complete," Elena said, "and accurate. And as of this morning has Zummansen provided independently by the investigating agency, which suggests they had parallel concerns predating our referral." She paused. "The provisional hold becoming a full investigative hold is, at this point, a question of when, not whether." Garrett Fenn wrote something on his legal pad. Camille watched his hand move and thought about what he was writing, and thought it was probably something that translated to "this is worse than we told our client it would be." Ronan had not looked away from her. She had been peripherally aware of this the entire time, the particular quality of his attention, which had always been one of the things about him that made rooms feel smaller. He was trying to find something in her face. She didn't know exactly what. The woman who had said "long meeting" in a soft voice in the dark, and then smiled and said nothing. The woman he had decided was no longer a threat because she had, for 6 years, made herself easy to underestimate. "Camille," he said. He said it in the register he used when he was speaking to her directly and not through the proxies of their respective attorneys. The register that acknowledged 6 years of a shared life. "Tell me what you want. You know what I want. I want to hear you say it." She looked at him steadily. Full and uncontested custody of Julian. No interference, no litigation, no maneuvering through the court system to establish access rights you can use as leverage. An acknowledgement in writing that the psychiatric evaluation submitted by Dr. Pfeiffer was fabricated for use in legal proceedings, which means you and Garrett and Pfeiffer all sign documents that can be submitted to the licensing board and, if necessary, to a court. The complete and accurate financial disclosure you were required to provide before our prenuptial agreement was signed, which means every entity, every account, every asset disclosed on the record, and a settlement of the marital estate that reflects the actual value of what was concealed, not the diminished picture your disclosure presented. She stopped. The room was very quiet. "That's not a negotiation," Garrett Fenn said carefully. "That's a surrender. The surrender happened before we walked in here," she said. "What we're negotiating is whether it happens cleanly or whether it happens through 2 years of federal proceedings and civil litigation and public disclosure of everything your client has spent 15 years hiding." She paused. "He called me at 2 in the morning," she said, still looking at Ronan. "He told me I didn't understand what I was touching on. He told me there were people connected to these accounts who wouldn't sit quietly." She opened her bag and put a small recorder on the table. "I recorded the call." Garrett Fenn looked at the recorder. His fountain pen stopped moving. "I also received a call this morning," Camille continued, "from an unknown number. A man who described himself as someone with significant interests in the Meridian network, who suggested the legal proceedings should resolve quietly and quickly for everyone's benefit, including mine and my son's." She looked at Ronan. "Would you like to tell me who that was?" Something happened in Ronan's face. Not large. A shift behind the eyes. The particular micro-expression of a man who has just realized the woman across from him knew something he didn't know she knew, and is now recalculating how many other things he might have miscalculated. "It was not authorized by me," he said. His voice had dropped. Stripped again, like it had been at 2 in the morning, of all the professional coding. "I believe you," she said, and she did. That call had the texture of something operating independently of Ronan, something that had its own interests in the outcome and had decided not to wait for him to manage it. Which means there are people in your organizations who are making their own calculations now. People who are deciding whether you're an asset or a liability. She leaned forward slightly. How long do you have, Ronan? Before the people who are worried about what a federal investigation uncovers decide that cooperating with that investigation is a better deal than protecting you. The silence that followed was the longest of the meeting. Garrett Fenn set his pen down. Ronan looked at the table. Not at her, at the surface of the table, at some middle distance in front of him where he was doing something private and difficult. She had watched him in enough rooms to know what his thinking face looked like. And this was it, but changed. The thinking face of a man who was running options and finding the set smaller than it had ever been before. The Pfeiffer situation, he said finally, still looking at the table. I can make that right. You will make that right, she said. That's not a concession. That's a requirement. He looked up at her. The other names. The people connected to the accounts beyond Meridian. The federal investigation expands. That's not something I can control, she said. I made a referral based on documentation I had. What the investigation finds beyond that is not within my authority to limit. You could characterize the referral differently. You could. No, she said it simply. I couldn't, and I wouldn't. His jaw tightened. She watched it. She watched him work through something that looked like anger, and then work past it into something that was harder to name, a kind of arriving, maybe. The specific moment when a person stops fighting the shape of a situation and begins, instead, to figure out how to survive it. Full custody, he said. Yes, I'd want access. Structured. Legal. She had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she'd thought about anything else in this process, because it was the one piece that was not simply a legal or financial calculation. It was a question about her son's life and what she believed was right for him, regardless of what she felt about his father. Supervised visitation, she said, once the federal proceedings resolve and depending on their outcome. Structured and documented, through the court, not privately arranged. Supervised. He said the word like it tasted wrong. You think I would? I think a man who paid a doctor to write a psychiatric evaluation of a woman he'd never examined is not someone who should have unsupervised access to a child until there's been significant time, and a court-appointed evaluation. She kept her voice level. That's not punishment. That's protection. For Julian. Which is the only thing I'm interested in. Another long silence. The financial disclosure, Garrett Fenn said. He was back to writing. A full accounting of all assets, including those held through subsidiary entities, would require. We have the accounting, Elena said. We've had most of it for weeks. What we're asking is for your client to confirm and sign off on the complete picture, rather than forcing us to litigate each asset individually through the civil courts, while the federal investigation runs parallel. And in exchange? In exchange, we don't contest the timeline of the federal referral. We don't add to the documentation submitted to FinCEN beyond what's already been provided. And we settle the marital estate without the prenuptial invalidation petition going to a full hearing, which means the terms of that settlement are private rather than publicly litigated. Garrett Fenn looked at Ronan. Ronan was looking at Camille. The quiet version, he said. That's what you're offering. For the divorce, she said. The federal investigation is not mine to offer anything on. I want to be very clear about that. What happens there happens. I'm not in a position to stop it, and I'm not willing to try. I know, he said, something in his voice. When he said it, not resignation exactly. Something more complicated. The tone of a man who had, maybe for the first time, looked clearly at what he'd built and understood that the thing he was being held accountable for was not simply the betrayal of a marriage. He picked up his water glass. He set it down without drinking. The people who called you this morning, he said quietly, they're not going to stop because we settled the divorce. They have their own exposure to worry about. I know. You need to be somewhere they can't reach easily. You and Julian. She looked at him. This was the thing she had not expected, not the warning itself, which she had been preparing for since the 2 a.m. phone call. But the fact that he was giving it to her directly, in front of witnesses, without any apparent strategic reason to do so, just giving it to her. Like a man who had run out of the energy required to be entirely calculated about everything. "I'm handling that," she said. "Where will you go?" "That's not something I'm going to tell you." He nodded slowly. He picked up the water glass again, and this time he drank from it, and when he set it down his hand was not entirely steady. She noticed. She didn't point it out. She didn't feel anything particular about it, not satisfaction, not sympathy. Just the fact of it. A man at the end of something. "All right," he said. "All right, meaning?" Elena asked. "Meaning I'll sign what you need me to sign." He looked at his attorney. "Draw it up." Garrett Fenn looked like a man who was making very rapid adjustments to a number of expectations he'd come into this room with. He gathered his legal pad and said he would need the afternoon. Elena said she would have draft documents ready by 5 o'clock. They stood. The attorneys moved to the side of the room and began talking in the quick, compact language of people who had real work to do immediately. Ronan stood at the table. Camille stood at the table. They were 6 feet apart. 6 years. An unborn son between them and everything else. "The boy," he said quietly. "Julian. Yes. You'll let him know he has a father." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll tell him the truth," she said, "when he's old enough to understand it. I'll tell him the truth about who you were and what happened, and let him decide for himself what he wants to do with that." "That's not." He stopped. He had been going to say "that's not fair," and she watched him realize halfway through the word that he had forfeited the right to that particular sentence. "It's the honest version," she said. "That's what I have to offer." He nodded. He put his hand briefly on the back of the chair in front of him, not gripping it, just touching it. Then he walked toward the door. He stopped before he reached it. He stood with his back to her for a moment. "I did love you," he said. "I want you to know that." She considered it. She thought about what it meant, coming from him. She thought about the kind of love that coexisted with planning to manufacture a psychiatric record and take a person's child and walk away with the money. She thought about whether that kind of love was worth naming. "I know," she said finally, because it was probably true, in whatever shape he was capable of. And because she was done spending energy on the parts of this that couldn't be resolved. He walked out. The door closed behind him. She stood at the table for a moment by herself. Elena and Nico were still on the far side of the room, and she put one hand on the back of her own chair and looked at the space where he had been and thought about nothing in particular. And everything at once. And then she picked up her bag and walked to where her brother was standing. Nico looked at her face. "Okay," he said. "Not yet," she said. "Me later." They left the building at 12:53. The afternoon was sharper than the morning had been, the cold more committed to itself. Camille stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in the cold and the exhaust and the particular smell of midday Manhattan, which was the smell of her entire adult life in one compressed breath. "Elena will have the documents by 5, she said. "I want you to read every word before I sign anything." "Obviously," Nico said, "and I need to call someone about the other situation." "The morning call. I can't let that sit." "Who do you call for something like that?" "Elena has a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. She mentioned it when we talked about the Finson referral. Someone who handles cases where organized financial crime intersects with the other kind of organized crime." She paused. "I think I need to talk to them directly, not through a referral, directly. Tell them about the call. Tell them what I know about the network beyond Meridian." Nico was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant step." "I know. Once you walk into that room, I'm aware." She looked at him. "But the alternative is waiting to see whether the person who called me this morning decides that quiet and quickly means something different than I want it to mean." He held her gaze. He nodded once. "Make the call," he said. She made the call from the car, sitting in the back with Nico beside her, while the driver navigated toward his apartment. Elena's FBI contact was a woman named Diane Reyes, who answered her own phone and spoke in the direct information-first style of someone who understood that context gathering was itself a form of efficiency. Camille told her about the call. She gave Razis the unknown number. She described what the voice had said, as precisely as she could remember it. Reyes asked 3 clarifying questions. Then she said, "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "Yes," Camille said. 8 o'clock. I'll send you the address." She hung up. She looked out the window at the city moving past. She thought, this is not over. She had known it wouldn't be over today, not with the federal investigation at its beginning and people beyond Ronan with their own exposures and their own decisions to make. She had known, when she made the Fincinsen referral, that she was starting something that would take longer than a season to finish. But today was a point of arrival at the same time. The documents would be signed. The marital estate would begin its legal unwinding. The psychiatric fraud would be documented and signed off on and submitted, and Dr. Harlan Pfeiffer of Connecticut would spend the next several years managing consequences he has accepted money to risk. And her son's custody was going to be settled in her favor with Ronan's own signature on the paper. Today mattered. What came after it would also matter. Both things were true. Julian was born 6 days later. It was a Tuesday morning, early, the kind of early that was still technically night at its edges. Camille had been awake since 3, not because of pain, but because something had shifted in her body that she recognized from everything she'd read as the beginning of the thing, and she had lain in the dark of Nico's guest room and breathed through it for an hour before she woke him. He drove her to the hospital. He sat in the waiting room for 11 hours. She did not have anyone else to call. There was no one she wanted there who wasn't already there. Nico and the medical team and the work of it, the particular physical work of bringing a person into the world, which she had been told was the most difficult thing a body could do, and which she found, in the middle of it, to be something she had no adequate comparisons for. It was beyond the scale of anything she'd done before, and she was in it alone in the fundamental way, and she did not ask for anything she couldn't find inside herself. At 4:27 in the afternoon, Julian Raphael Varela was born. She had dropped Blackridge from her name the morning after the meeting on Park Avenue. She had filed the paperwork herself, one of the few things in the last month she had handled without an attorney, because she wanted to do it directly, personally, with her own hand on the pen. Julian Raphael Varela. He weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He had dark hair and a face that was startlingly complete, not the vague, unformed face she'd half expected, but something specific already, something that was entirely itself. She held him, and he was very still after his first minute of complaint, very present against her chest. And she looked at him and felt something shift in her that she didn't have a word for. Not the grand transformation of movies and books, not a sudden erasure of everything hard. Just something settling, permanently and without drama, into place. She was his mother. He was hers. The rest of the world could negotiate with that fact or not, but the fact itself was not available for negotiation. Nico came in when they let him and stood beside the bed and looked at his nephew with an expression that Camille had never seen on his face before, an unguarded, completely unmanaged expression of something that looked very much like wonder. "Hey," he said softly, to Julian, not to her. Julian moved one small fist, apparently at random. "Yeah," Nico said. "I know." He sat down in the chair beside the bed. He didn't say anything else for a while. Neither did she. Outside, the hospital continued its own enormous business. The light in the room turned from afternoon gold to something dimmer. A nurse came and went. Machines made their quiet, continuous sounds. Eventually, Nico said, "Elena called while you were in there." The signed documents came through, both sets. She nodded. She had expected that. Ronan had been given until close of business to sign, and apparently he had. And Diane Reyes's office, Nico continued. A courtesy call. 2 additional individuals connected to the Meridian network were taken in for questioning today. Do you know who? One is the attorney who structured the Cayman registrations. The other, he paused. The other is the man they think made the call to you. She looked at Julian, who had fallen asleep against her, with the absolute commitment of someone who had no concerns whatsoever about the world he'd arrived in. Good, she said. She stayed in the hospital for 2 days. On the second evening, she sat up in bed while Julian slept in the clear-sided bassinet beside her, and she took out her phone and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened her contacts and found the number and called. It rang 4 times. She thought he might not answer, then he did. Ronan's voice was flat. "Camille." "He's here," she said. "He was born Tuesday. He's healthy." Silence on the other end. She had not planned to call. She had decided, somewhere in the last 2 days, that she would, because she believed she had always believed, even through everything, that there was a version of doing this that was not about erasure. That whatever Julian eventually understood about his father and chose to make of it, it should come from the truth and not from a deliberate void. And this call was part of that, even though it was not easy, and even though part of her wished it could be otherwise. "Julian," Ronan said. The name, just the name. "Julian Raphael Varela," she said. Another silence, longer. "He's healthy," Ronan said. Making sure he'd heard correctly, maybe. Or needing to hear it again. "Very. And you, I'm okay," she heard him exhale. It was a long, complicated breath, the kind that had too many things in it to be simple. "I signed everything," he said. "I know, thank you." "You don't have to thank me for I know," she said. "I'm thanking you anyway, because it's the right thing to do, and I'm choosing to do the right thing, regardless of what else is happening." Pause. "Camille." He said her name with something in it she didn't analyze. She was done analyzing every register of his voice. "Take care of him. That's not something you need to say to me," she said. Evenly, not unkindly. "I know that." He stopped. "Then I'm sorry. For the Pfeiffer thing. I'm sorry for that specifically. I want you to know I was afraid of losing everything, and it was wrong. There isn't a version of it that isn't just wrong." She had not expected the apology. She had not expected it to feel like it did, either, which was complicated, not a relief, not a resolution, but something she could acknowledge and set down. "I hear you," she said. "That's all?" "That's enough for tonight," she said. "Good night, Ronan." She hung up. She sat in the quiet hospital room and listened to Julian breathe the small, unconscious work of it, perfectly steady, and outside the window the city did its night. And she was 34 years old, and her name was Camille Varela, and she had a son and a legal team and a federal witness interview scheduled for Thursday morning, and approximately 14 things she needed to do in the next 2 weeks that she had not yet figured out the logistics of. She picked up her phone and started a list. She was still adding to it when she fell asleep. The months that followed were not clean. She had known they wouldn't be. Knowing a thing and living inside it are different experiences, and she had been living inside it, the endless procedural grind of it. The depositions and document requests, and the particular exhaustion of being simultaneously a new mother and a witness in a federal financial crimes investigation. She had retained a separate attorney for the federal side. She had moved with Julian to a sublet in Brooklyn that Nico had found and vetted and swept for what she'd stopped calling paranoia and started calling appropriate precaution. She had spoken to Diane Reyes 7 times in the first month, and 4 times the month after that, and twice the month after that, which was a trajectory that told her the investigation was finding its own footing and needed her less as a primary source. She had also, in the 3rd month, received a call from a woman she didn't know. The woman's name was Patricia Sondheim. She was 58 years old and had been married for 22 years to a man who had turned out to have an organizational structure not unlike Ronan's, in an industry not unlike Ronan's, and she had found herself 3 years ago in the position of trying to untangle her legal and financial situation from a man whose resources and connections made the process feel impossible. Patricia had read about the Blackridge case in a financial publication that had covered the FinCEN investigation and the civil settlement in a single brief article that named Camille as the wife who had initiated the proceedings. "I need help," Patricia had said on the phone, not crying. The voice of someone past crying into the territory that was colder and more functional. Not emotional support. "I need someone who understands how to find what they're hiding." Camille had sat in the sublet kitchen with Julian asleep in the next room and thought about it for a moment. She thought about the years of forensic investigation before Ronan. She thought about what she now knew that she hadn't known then. She thought about the woman's voice, flat, controlled, the particular texture of someone who had been carrying something alone for too long. "Come to Brooklyn," she had said. We'll talk. That conversation lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Camille had made a phone call to Nico and another phone call to Elena, and within a week, she had begun the process of filing the incorporation documents for what would eventually be called Varela Forensic Group, a financial investigation firm specializing in hidden assets and protective legal strategy for individuals in complex and often dangerous marital and financial situations. She had not planned it that way. She had not sat in the penthouse in Manhattan at 2 in the morning and thought, when this is over, I'll build a firm. It emerged from the specific gravity of what she'd been through, the knowledge she had, the gaps she'd found in what existed to help people in those situations, particular anger she'd been carrying about how hard it had been to find anyone equipped to help her when she needed it. Nico came on as the technical lead. Elena provided legal oversight in an advisory role. They hired 2 more analysts in the first 6 months, both women who had worked in financial forensics and had their own reasons for wanting to do this specific work. They were quiet about it at first. Word moved through channels she hadn't anticipated: attorneys who worked family law, therapists who worked with clients in coercive relationships, a network of referrals that expanded slowly and then faster than she'd expected. By the end of the first year, they had more cases than they could handle with their current staff. She hired 2 more people. She was doing intake paperwork at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She looked at the screen. Ronan Blackridge had entered a guilty plea in the federal case. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The sentencing was scheduled for the following spring. She put the phone face down on the desk. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about the man who had crouched in front of her chair and said, "I'm going to be more present." She thought about the voice at 2 in the morning, stripped of its professional surface. She thought about him standing at the table on Park Avenue with his hand on the back of a chair, saying, "I did love you." She thought about her son, who was 9 months old and had recently discovered that pulling himself to standing on the edge of the coffee table was one of the great experiences available to a person his size, and who was currently asleep in the room at the end of the hall with the sound machine running, with the sound sheen Neesonly and the small nightlight she'd bought impulsively because she wanted him to never be afraid of the dark. She felt not nothing, not triumph, something more interior than either, something that required no expression and no audience. She picked the phone back up and turned it face up and set it aside, and she went back to the intake paperwork. 3 more hours. Then she'd sleep. Spain came the following spring. She had chosen it partly for the practical reasons. Julian's legal situation was fully resolved. Her firm was established enough to operate with some remote capacity, and she had wanted, with a clarity that surprised her, put ocean between herself and the particular geography of the last 2 years. New York was her home, but it was also the landscape of everything she was finished with, and she needed a different horizon for a while. She rented a house on the coast near Cataca's white walls, a terrace, the Mediterranean doing its particular blue thing beyond the low stone wall at the property's edge. It was smaller than anything she'd lived in during the Blackridge years. She had 2 suitcases and Julian's things and her laptop, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Nico visited in June. He spent 2 weeks and got sunburned on the first day, despite being told twice to use higher SPF. And she watched him sit on the terrace in the evenings and look at the water with the expression of someone who had not fully realized until now how tired they had been. He held Julian with the confidence of someone who had logged enough hours to know what he was doing, and Julian grabbed his uncle's beard with both hands, with the enthusiasm of a person who had found the greatest toy in the world. And Nico made a noise of protest and detached the small fingers with great care and then made a face at Julian that produced a laugh. And Camille sat across the terrace and watched them and felt something she could name now. Quiet. Real quiet, not the performed quiet of those weeks in the penthouse when she was working under Ronan's nose. Real quiet on the inside underneath everything. She had earned it by the most expensive route possible. She would not have chosen it this way, but it was hers. In the evenings when Julian was asleep and Nico had gone to his room to do whatever he did on his laptop when he wasn't in investigator mode, she sat on the terrace with a glass of something cold and looked at the water. She had been a person who thought continuously, who ran variables and assessed and planned in the background of every quiet moment. She was still that person. She did not think you stopped being who you were because you'd been through something. You carried it. You incorporated it. You became a version of yourself that included it. But on the terrace, some evenings, she let herself just look at the water for a while without running anything. Just the water and the light changing on it and the sound of it reaching the rocks below, patient and indifferent and entirely itself. She thought sometimes about what Ronan had said. You took everything from me. She had thought about what she'd answered. You threw everything away. You decided your wife and child were possessions. True, she believed it still. But she had also had enough time and enough quiet to sit with the more complicated truth that sat behind it, that a person who throws everything away is not simply a villain. They are a person who made choices, bad ones, over a long time, for reasons that included ambition and fear, and possibly the particular kind of loneliness that comes from spending years being powerful and surrounded by people who are afraid of you. She did not excuse any of it. She was not interested in excusing it. But she had stopped needing him to be simply a monster, because simple monsters didn't require any of the complicated grief she'd been carrying and hadn't yet fully set down. She was working on that. Julian had his first birthday in that house by the sea. It was a small gathering. Nico, Elena, who had flown in because she had appointed herself a kind of unofficial guardian of both the firm and the family, and two women Camille had met in Catechase, who had found their way into something like friendship over shared dinners and long walks, and the particular ease of people who have no history together, and therefore no performance required. Julian sat on a blanket on the terrace in the afternoon light, with a piece of cake on a plate in front of him that he regarded for a moment with great seriousness, as though assessing its structural integrity, and then attacked with both hands. Everyone laughed. Julian looked up from the wreckage of the cake at the laughing faces around him and smiled with his whole self, the particular smile of a person who has not yet learned to moderate their joy for the comfort of others. Camille reached out and touched his hair, dark and soft and curling slightly at the temples where it was longest. His father's hair. His own face, entirely his own, looking up at her. "Happy birthday," she said. He said something back that was not language yet, but was very clearly addressed to her. Something with great conviction in it. Something that meant she was not entirely sure. She was still learning the dialect of him, something like "I know. I know. I've got us too." She had not planned to feel what she felt in that moment. She had been, for so long, operating in the mode that precluded feeling too much at once, the focused, careful, resource-managing mode that had gotten her through the hardest year of her life. She had kept herself in it longer than was probably necessary, because stepping out of it felt like lowering a shield, and lowering a shield was something she had not fully trusted herself to do yet. But she was sitting on a terrace in Spain, in the afternoon light with cake on her hands, and her son looking up at her, and the sea visible beyond the white wall and the people she had chosen around her. And it came through anyway, not a flood, not a collapse. Something slower, something that asked to be let in rather than demanded it. She let it in, she cried briefly. The unself-conscious kind, not the kind she'd trained herself to wait for appropriate moments for. She just cried for a minute, sitting cross-legged on the blanket with Julian, looking at her with the focused curiosity of a scientist, and Nico pretending not to notice, and Elena handing her a napkin without comment, and the sea doing nothing, except exactly what it always did. Then she wiped her face. She picked up a piece of cake. She ate it. Julian, deciding this was the correct response to the situation, returned his own attention to his plate with renewed focus, and around them the afternoon continued. And the light moved across the water the way it had been moving across water for longer than there were people to watch it. And Camille Varela sat inside her life, the real one, the one she had built out of the wreckage of the other one, and found it sufficient. Not perfect. There was no perfect version of this. There was the version where she was still slightly too alert in certain situations. Now, still occasionally woke at 2 in the morning with her heart doing something anxious before her brain caught up with where she actually was. There was the version where Julian would grow up, knowing something had happened that shaped his beginning, and would have questions she would answer as honestly as she could, and still might not fully satisfy. There was the version where the firm was consuming, and sometimes exhausting, and the cases she took were full of the particular darkness of situations where people had been used by people who should have protected them. There was also this, the terrace and the water and the afternoon, and her son's face turned toward hers. There was Nico, across from her, sunburned and eating cake, with the relaxed expression of a man who had finally stopped being afraid for his sister. There was work that meant something done by people she trusted. There was Julian, who at 1 year old had the particular quality that some children have of making every room they enter feel like something important is happening, which Camille privately believed had nothing to do with her and everything to do with him. She had not become a different person. She had become a more complete version of the person she'd always been. The investigator. The woman who paid attention when people assumed she wasn't. The woman who could hold something difficult in both hands for a long time without dropping it. She had simply at last stopped holding the wrong things. She stood from the blanket. She picked Julian up, and he grabbed her hair with both hands with the same focused enthusiasm he'd applied the cake, and she winced, and carefully detached his fingers and shifted him onto her hip, and walked to the edge of the terrace. And they stood there together, her and her son, and looked at the sea. The water was blue, not one blue, 20 blues, moving in the particular way of things that have been moving long enough to do it without effort. Julian made a sound, a word beginning maybe, or just a sound. She wasn't always sure of the distinction yet. He pointed at the water with one finger, the way he pointed at things he wanted to understand. See, she said. He said it back, imperfectly and absolutely recognizably. Yes, she said. See. He kept pointing. He had more questions. He always had more questions, which was something she found, despite the exhaustion of it, completely acceptable. She would answer them, all of them, or as many as she could, for as long as he kept asking. She turned from the water. She carried him back toward the people and the light and the remains of the birthday cake and the life she had built from scratch with her own 2 hands. She did not look back.